Barely Research Facts is a fact-based podcast brought to you by ArtNowThus, an experiential arts agency based out of Mumbai. Each week, we pick a word at random, dive into it, and see what it brings to us. We are your hosts. My name is Ragini, and this is Shar. Let's go. Hi guys, and welcome to our 20th episode of Barely Research Facts.
I can't believe we lasted this long.
I cannot wrap my head around it.
20 episodes.
Amazing. Yeah.
Wow.
You know what I think 20 episodes calls for?
Mm-hmm.
Calls for popping a bottle of champagne.
Pop! That's the sound effect. I'm sorry for blowing the audio.
And that's our word for this week. Guys, it's pop.
Pop, yeah.
Yeah, we're popping our 20th episode with the word pop.
Now, why did we choose this word? I don't know. It seems very innocuous. It seems like you wouldn't get much out of it. But, lo and behold, a full-length episode with the word pop. Now, one of two things that comes to mind is pop culture. And while, everybody's really tired and it's an overdone topic and we all know how it started, I'm going to talk a little bit about it.
Of course, I love pop culture.
So I like the idea. I've just cobbled together sort of just how pop culture evolved. You'd think that it was something of, something that happened in the recent past, but actually pop culture has been going since, or at least a phenomenon that can be described as pop culture has been going since the 1800s, the latter part of the 19th century. Wow. Now, sociologists consider culture as the formation of traditions and trends that link humans in a common group. So human culture has existed for, since prehistoric times. However, those prehistoric societies, their tradition, their arts, their rituals, they're generally considered as folk art rather than pop culture, because popular culture, by definition, requires that the masses, regardless of what kind of culture they belong to, are interested in it, are engaged in it, and are practicing it. So how would that happen, you ask? With the Industrial Revolution, obviously. So the industrial era, which is around the late 18th century, is when rural masses began to migrate to cities. And this led to, obviously, urbanization in the first, but also it led to less homogeneous small societies. So cities bursting with different kinds of cultural histories, different kinds of ethnicities, different practices. But if all of them were interested in, engaged in one particular type of trend or, fashion or whatever it was, that's pop culture, because regardless of their backgrounds, there's a mutual common interest in all of these things.
I actually did not know this. In my head, pop culture was always just popular culture.
Yeah.
And I just thought it would transcend, across time. But I did not know that it would actually take this kind of permeation of culture and kind of this migration of multiple cultures to create this one phenomena called pop culture.
Yeah, because you don't really think about it. We're children of urban societies, so we don't really think about it.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. I find things like this really fascinating. Now,
yeah, same.
So I found this article that posited an interesting theory. I don't know if it's proven, and I'm sure it's disputable in many ways, but apparently 3 early significant popular culture mileposts are, in chronological order, wedding ceremonies, music performed from written scores, and the establishment of fashion styles. Now, you think about them, they sort of make sense, don't they?
Yeah, they do actually.
They sort of make this. They sound like they're very small sections of culture, but actually they sort of make sense. So wedding ceremonies, predating even biblical accounts, began traditions based on religious tenets and quickly became ingrained in society. So, even now, because of the multicultural nature of the world, of, how people traveling all over the place, marrying all sorts of people, we incorporate wedding traditions that are sort of interesting or sometimes even trendy. Interesting either to the couple themselves or just trendy as a whole, like something borrowed, something blue. You see even people who aren't necessarily Christian doing it. The second thing is music, or music performed from written scores. During the Renaissance, composers began committing notes to paper, and so they created the opportunity for music to be shared exponentially and beyond the first person familiarity. So, it wouldn't just be someone who was literate and had access to these musical performances, who would be describing it to someone else, it could actually be played by someone because of scored music. So, so that's one aspect. And then the last one is fashion. Fashion styles took clothing beyond mere functionality. And, obviously the royalty and the aristocracy were already interested in these things. But the emergence of like the French bourgeois class and simple technological advances in clothing manufacture, such as the sewing machine, gave styles such a popular appeal. Like you could, if you were enterprising enough and you had a sewing machine, you could look at someone who was, quote unquote high class or rich and look at their clothes and then recreate them. So this again created that mass appeal.
Adoption of,
So,
I didn't.
And that's why in a couple of 100 years, because of the Industrial Revolution, in a couple of 100 years, we went from like, tights and lace cuffs and, corsets, but corsets are back, but things like that, to teenagers now wearing, athleisure or like, track
pants around their
knees. So it's all very interesting to me. And that's sort of like the evolution of pop culture and also a little bit about the definition of it. So thank you, technology.
For giving us this wonderful phenomena.
Yeah.
So when you said, it kind of dates back to the late 19th century, but one of the sort of this permeating figure that kind of still influences pop culture so heavily even today that came to my mind was Shakespeare.
Yeah, okay.
Shakespeare lived, almost a century before. He lived in the 17th century. But to just think about, because I was almost everything that I was going through, there's so much of a reference around Shakespeare in terms of just, sort of pop culture stereotypes in terms of, you have the Romeo figure, and then you have the Hamlet figure, and you have the Lady Macbeth. And, these are just like things that have kind of permeated across different works of art that have kind of been created since his time. He's obviously been credited with creating, just building out and creating these God knows how many words that were not in use before his time, or popularizing them. And so at the time, the thing was that you had high art and then you had low art, and high art was obviously, the more classy art that was enjoyed by the aristocracy and the, the higher echelons of society. And then you had low art that was kind of more popularly performed in pubs and public squares and stuff like that. So apart from the fact that, his work kind of transcends time and, it still is equally relevant because he wrote about human nature. A lot of his work was based in human nature, and that kind of will always stand the test of time. And so it didn't matter which class of society you were in, there was an appeal. But also he was such a prolific writer that so much of his work is kind of like his work just kind of spread across because there was just so much of it to kind of go around.
Yeah.
And so I came across, and I was just thinking about things like, we don't even realize it now. Romeo and Juliet, okay, it's a stereotype that we're all quite aware of. But if I think about when I was growing up, 10 Things I Hate About You, which is actually Taming of the Shrew. Yeah. And and a bunch of other things She's the Man, which is basically 12th Night. And we
I love that movie.
Not just this. I love that movie. It's so good. But he does, he's had an influence in psychology, political theory, medicine, law,
language itself, like phrases.
He apparently there are some 118,000 lines that he has sort of created, phrases that people didn't know of earlier.
Well, I know a couple. Yeah. Can I tell you a couple?
Yeah.
I know Love is Blind. That's one of his.
Oh, that was Shakespeare? I did not know that. Yeah.
Green-Eyed Monster. Also his.
I know this,
And I can't remember the rest.
Apparently the term swagger was created by Shakespeare.
No.
Was invented by Shakespeare. Yeah. So he's attributed with 1,700 words that are now included in the English dictionary that come from Shakespearean language. Wow. And swagger was one of them. Addiction was apparently one of them. It's bizarre, the kind of stuff that
you could attribute to him. Wow.
Yeah, eyeball, apparently. Weird.
What? Nobody called an eyeball before?
Yeah, I don't know what they were calling him before that.
Before Willie?
Oh. Yeah, and also, so in terms of just current day popular culture, obviously, the character stereotypes that have, and then, there is, he has the enduring legacy of, you have Puck, who is this, light-hearted little
naughty character,
around. Yeah, and, and so... Yeah, extremely. And then you have Falstaff, who's this big, round, jester-like character. And then these characters kind of have become stereotypes and have, we see them even now when we watch a movie, his character stereotypes are so obvious. Hamlet is an extremely this broody character with a dark history or or a troubled future. And so I found it really interesting. I mean, I brought this up as an aside.
Out damn spot. Sorry.
Yes, yeah.
My dad used to say it to us kids when we were being annoying. Out damn spots.
So when you mentioned that, pop, as a phenomena, pop culture started at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
But his works kind of have influenced so much of what we see as pop culture today. And I thought it was kind of amazing to just see the extent of the influence.
Yeah.
Anyway, so going from just Shakespeare's influence on pop culture to, again, just kind of trying to understand. I read this really interesting study about pop culture, the rate of pop culture evolution vis-a-vis human evolution. And, when you think of pop culture, and when we think of music or films or whatever,
or weddings.
Sometimes, yeah, anything. And, it's always like, oh my God, things are just changing so fast. And, you always, every generation's constant lament is just about how the music of the generation that follows is just
trash.
Unhearable because it's, But there was Mr. Armand Leroy, who was an evolutionary biologist, made it his life's mission at this point to just kind of decide that does pop culture really change as fast as we think it does?
Okay.
And so he did this really interesting study because according to him, he doesn't think that, when you talk about music, he's like, it's not popular music doesn't change as fast as we do. The songs will change, but quality of the music or the melody will more or less stay the same. And we just don't realize it because the songs change. So to do that, he explored the idea of a study that would compare the rates of evolution of certain cultural phenomena, pop music, automobiles, medical literature, and 19th century novels, with those of, wait for it, the scarlet tiger moth, Darwin's finches of the Galapagos Islands, and a snail and a moth. And now these animals have particularly been examined by biologists over the years because they demonstrate evolution in action over the decades, because the creatures represent the upper limits to the rate of organic evolutionary change, which basically means that, they evolve at a much faster pace. Therefore, we are able to study it. So their results published show that the evolutionary pace of modern culture is generally the same as many animal populations, which is to say that it is actually a lot slower than people think. Okay. It's not like from one generation to the next, culture just becomes unidentifiable and absolutely unfathomable. But organic evolution isn't as slow as Darwin used to believe it was. The belief that culture evolves super fast hasn't held ground as per the results of the study.
Yeah. So
they studied 17,094 songs that were entered into the Billboard Hot 100 charts of hits in the US between 1960 to 2010.
Yeah.
2,200 fossil fuel powered car models that sold in the US between 1950 and 2010. 2,203 American, Irish, and English novels published between 1840 and 1819, collected by the Stanford University Literary Lab, and 170,577 clinical articles published in the British Medical Journal, now the BMJ, from 1960 to 2008. So now for all of these cultural populations, the researchers identify scores of specific traits and characteristics such as loud guitar or smooth harmonies in pop songs, engine power and wheelbase in cars, various medical subjects in the BMJ, and topics such as the English aristocracy, grief and sorrows in the novels. Now, they then used advanced statistical methods to track the frequencies and values of those traits over time. So, for example, the paper would show that loud guitars showed a consistently high average frequency and was still preserved in Lenny Kravitz's Fly Away in 1998. So basically, it
stayed
as a constant.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they were also, let's not forget, they were also tracking the finches and the insects on the other side. The computer-based procedure, and analogous to measuring finches' beaks over time, enabled the researchers to determine the evolutionary trajectories or the rate of change of the four cultural populations. So based on those four species that they originally based their study on, of which they based this subset of cultural phenomena against, it sort of showed that they were almost comparable. So at the rate at which a finch's beak was evolving is about the same rate at which pop culture is evolving right now. So
I'm just amazed at this study.
Yeah. And so there is a book called The Beak of the Finch by a gentleman called Jonathan Wiener, who wrote about the work of a couple who were both evolutionary biologists, Peter and Rosemary Grant, who spent nearly 50 years studying these finches in the Galapagos. And what they found is that they could actually see evolution happening right in front of their eyes as the condition on the islands changed. So as vegetation changed or seas changed, the beak of the finches were evolving accordingly, and it was moving fast enough for them to be able to record this in their 50-year tenure on this island, which I think is fascinating.
Wow, that's a long commitment.
Yeah, and to think that rock and roll is evolving at the same pace as Darwin's finches on the Galapagos is an absolute surprise, because we think that, oh my God, 20 years and you just the music sound just changes completely. But actually, it kind of has a way of averaging out, because what we see is a lot of change over a short period of time.
Yeah. And I suppose it also has something to do with popular culture. So what's popular right now is what people see as the music of the decade or the age or this particular time. But that's not necessarily the case. Even though there's Ariana Grande at the top of the charts right now, there's also bands like the Black Keys and Panic at the Disco and other bands that are still doing music that is similar to homage to 70s or 80s or 90s. So.
And also what they say is that once something gets popular, people start it becomes something that kind of gets replicated for a long period of time. And so once people are buying this, pop music will keep kind of regurgitating the same kind of tune or the same kind of melody in different, in different songs. And at some point you saturate. And then suddenly what happens is you go back to an older phenomena. So basically, it creates a cycle, and the cycle continues until there is a big shock to the system that leads to a sort of a new invention or something new that comes onto the scene. And then that picks up. And that's what kind of evolves any kind of cultural phenomena to its next stage, which is a really slight move, but it obviously is moving at a much slower pace than we imagine.
Yeah.
So the interesting part of the study is that it actually proves that pop culture is probably evolving at the same rate as biology or as any other biological mammal or creature is evolving at. And that is really fascinating.
That is. So carrying on with our fixation with pop this episode, do you know that some people call soda pop?
Yes.
Okay. And it's sort of it's restricted. I tried to look this up to see where else soda or Coke or whatever, any carbonated drink is called pop. And it's predominantly in the US, in the Midwest, Minnesota. They have a very specific accent, and it's interesting, but they are predominantly known for calling soda pop. Also, other parts like Boston and things like that. There are places that, this phenomenon happens. Now, why is it called that? So I want to just talk about the earliest reference to the term pop. And apparently this was in 1812. I didn't think it went back that far. But in 1812, in a letter written by English poet Robert Southey, in this letter, he says, "Called on A. Harrison and found he was at Carlisle, but that we were expected to supper, excused ourselves on the necessity of eating at the inn, supped there upon trout and roast fowl, drank some most admirable cider, and a new manufactory of a nectar, between soda water and ginger beer, and called pop. Because pop goes the cork when it is drawn, and pop you would go off too if you drank too much of it." So yeah, that's why soda is called
there the
pop.
name stuck.
Oh, that's the earliest reference to it. He says it as though it's, he and his group of friends came up with it, or he was told this story and it was interesting. So it was around that time that it happened. Now, the term is obviously onomatopoeic, which means that it follows the word follows the sound that is created. I wanted to list some other onomatopoeic words, just, for a lark. Why not?
Yeah.
Bark is one of them. I did not know that.
Okay.
I just thought it evolved separately and was a coincidence. Cackle, chatter, flip, flop, hush, jangle or jingle, moan. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
And
I can...
and the most commonplace, tick-tock. So, yeah, it's the lazy man's way of naming something, and I love it.
So, also talking about things that go pop, I'm going to do a little segment on Pop Goes the Weasel.
Oh, the poor weasel.
I know. I know. But turns out that the origins of famed nursery rhyme are from basically in packed sweatshops in London.
Okay.
Where in the textile industry, a spinner's weasel is a device that was used for measuring the length of yarn, and the mechanism would make a popping sound when the correct length has been reached. So one of the reasons why the weasel went pop is because it reached the correct length. So,
okay.
Pop Goes the Weasel. However, the third verse of the same rhyme could suggest an alternative origin, which is the third verse goes, up and down the city road, in and out the eagle, that's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel. And now in this case, it's a slightly, this isn't as well, I don't know if the previous one was cheerful because it is based in a sweatshop, but in London slang, pop is a word for pawn. And so
Really?
it would potentially, yeah, I didn't know this either. Oh, I thought you would know it. So I just went through it I totally know this as well. And weasel can be traced to the Cockney rhyming slang for weasel and stoat, or in other words, a coat. So a very poor Victorian Londoner would have their Sunday best pawned, popped, for when times got hard, and then, they could probably go and get it back. It's also another way of saying that, sometimes people would be drinking. So Eagle was a tavern that was located in London. And so, there was another way of saying that you drank and you drank up such a bill that you couldn't afford your bill, so you popped your weasel in order to continue to drink. So that's the origin of the nursery rhyme, Pop Goes the Weasel.
It started in a pub.
Cute. Or a sweatshop, one of the two.
Or a sweatshop. Decidedly two things that are not children related.
Should not be.
Yeah. One thing that adults and children love alike is popping bubble wrap. Would you agree?
Oh my God, I love it. You say it and I can feel it under my hands already.
So I was interested in, why is it so satisfying? Why do you feel like if you don't finish the whole reel of bubble wrap or whatever piece of bubble wrap, if you don't finish popping it, then something bad will happen.
End.
Yeah. Something bad will happen. I haven't ever not done it, so I haven't found out. Now, obviously, a study has happened. Kathleen M. Dillon, now psychology professor at the Western New England College, published a study in a journal called Psychological Reports back in the early 1990s. So, pioneer. She says that even though it seems like a very sort of lighthearted topic that people, you'd rather write about something more heavy, I guess. I guess she was being judged by her fellow scientists. She defends her inquiry into this particular topic, quoting a 1970s tome about the calming powers of touch. Now, this is an actual book written by Ashley Montague, and it's called Touching: The Human Significance of the Skin, and it was published in 1986. So she quotes this book in saying, in ancient Greece, it was customary, and is still so in much of Asia, to carry a smooth surface stone or amber or jade, sometimes called a fingering piece. Such a worry bead, as it is also named by its pleasant feel, serves to produce a calming effect. The telling of beads by religious Catholics seems to also produce a similar result, which I'm like, okay, I'd probably carry a rock around, a smooth rock around, if it made me feel good.
Calm me down.
Yeah. But yeah, I'd equate this to also the videos that you see on Instagram and YouTube and all these other things, which are like 10 most satisfying compilation video, watch to calm yourself down kind of thing. So Dillon also added that keeping your hands busy with little projects like needlework is considered relaxing, and suggests that attacking a sheet of bubble wrap might work in the same way. So she wasn't just suggesting and positing things, she did a study. Her research showed that undergraduates in this study who got to pop 2 sheets of bubble wrap felt at once calmer and more awake after they were done than before they'd started. They also reported higher levels of calmness and alertness than a group that was not granted popping privileges, which is a phrase I will now incorporate into my daily lexicon, popping privileges.
Yeah, I love it.
And borrowing from the theories of Robert E. Thayer, who is a psychologist who studied biological explanation for moods, she speculates that it has to do with a very natural human response to stress, freezing in your tracks. Freezing in your tracks, but also having something to do so that you can say, I'm not just sat here panicking, I'm actually worrying my worry beads. So, in real danger might be helpful because it gives you a moment to assess the situation and what action to take. But a similar thing might also happen when people are nervous or stressed, which is true because stress triggers your fight or flight response. So it could be a little that nervous motions like finger tapping, foot jiggling, or bubble wrap popping are ways of releasing that muscle tension to prepare you to get into action and reduce stress. So yeah, if you're popping bubble wrap, there's a deeper meaning behind it.
Yeah. Now
you
that we've got you
stressed?
thinking about that. But also, I think I would much rather pop bubble wrap than, rub a stone in my pockets. Because we're stressed and someone's rubbing a stone in their pockets because they're stressed.
Also,
Could go
it's
either
a bit
way.
weird if you have your hand in your pockets and it's like moving.
And you're just rubbing something in the
I think it's more culturally acceptable to be popping bubble wrap than rubbing something in your pants.
Yeah. I'd much rather have my popping privileges.
Yeah. From popping privileges to the privilege of explaining pop art. Now, I know some people...
Oh dear.
Oh dear. Oh dear indeed. Now, I know some people... I think pop art is something you either love or hate. It just makes you feel all the emotions, whether negative or positive. And I understand it. And so we're not going to preach to you. We're not going to pick a pop art painting and explain why it's amazing. I'm just going to talk about how the pop art movement evolved. I think because it's an interesting story and it shows the domino effect that not only different art movements have on each other, but also the times, what's happening in the world has how that affects movements of art. Now, in 1952, a gathering of artists in London, calling themselves the Independent Group, began meeting regularly to discuss topics such as mass culture's place in fine art, the found object, and science and technology. And just to give you context, Britain in the early 1950s this is so close to the end of the Second World War, and, austerity was in place. There was a certain joie de vivre that was missing from the world. And obviously people were still dealing with the stress and trauma of just coming out of a world war. So Britain in the early 1950s was emerging from the austerity of the post-war years, and its citizens were ambivalent about American pop culture in particular. While the group was suspicious of its commercial character, they were enthusiastic about the rich world pop culture seemed to promise for the future. So to give you context, again, this is like, the industrial aspect, the commercial and industrial aspect of society coming to the fore, where everything was mass-produced, People were getting excited about like televisions and print media, broadcast media, all of these things that were new, shiny, and were used to different purposes than just what they were used for during the war. The imagery they discussed at length included things found in Western movies, science fiction, comic books, billboards, automobile design, and rock and roll music, of course. So in the 1940s and 50s, in New York, abstract expressionism had developed. And abstract expressionism was meant to encompass not only the work of painters who fill their canvases with fields of color and abstract forms and, all of these wild and wonderful things, but also those who attacked their canvases with gestural expressionism. So if you're thinking like Jackson Pollock, like violent streaks and dots and, all these things that are formless and shapeless, but somehow manage to evoke and depict emotion of certain type. They were shaped obviously by surrealism, but they were definitely far removed from it. So abstract expressionism was at the time sort of at the forefront in the art world. And this resulted in the emergence of something called neo-Dadaism. Artists working in New York City faced a critical juncture in modern art. Follow abstract expressionists or rebel against the strict formalism advocated by many schools of modernism. So one of the people at the forefront of this was Jasper Johns. He was sort of going against the conventions of abstract paintings, adding things that were definitely not abstract, things like targets and flags and handprints and letters and numbers. So he was sort of on the cusp of not only abstract expressionism, but also this new form that hadn't been named as yet. And so this middle section between abstract expressionism and pop art is called Neo-Dada. So if you look at the paintings from this, they incorporated aspects from the surrounding world into their art that were definitely recognizable as these objects. Like I said, targets, flags, handprints, found objects of all sorts. And they used traditional materials like oil paint. Now, from this, pop art started with New York artists, one very famous one who everybody either loves or hates, Andy Warhol. Also Roy Lichtenstein, James Rosenquist, and many others. They drew on popular imagery and were actually, they became the international phenomenon. The identifiable imagery that they used in their paintings was a major shift, and the subject matter that they used became far from traditional high art themes of like morality, mythology, and classic history. Rather, it sort of emphasized the commercial aspect of the world at the time, like, mass production. And if you remember, one of the pieces by Andy Warhol was just a Campbell's like soup can.
Yeah.
And if you had subscribed to our newsletter, you would have learned a little bit about the Marilyn Monroe diptych, which, all of these things are so far removed from what was happening at the time. They were revolutionary. They were new. People hated it, but also loved it. And, I think that it's an interesting phenomenon. So to recap, just how things changed from literally the late 1940s to the 1960s. In just those 11 years, the art world went through such major shifts and changes that it's just an interesting phenomenon. So quite far removed from Finch Beaks, but and evolving at a much quicker pace. But it sort of reflected the times which were changing really quickly.
Yeah. Oh wow, yeah. I mean, I'm fully in love with pop art. I think it's an amazing movement. I love the colors. I love everything to do with it.
Yeah.
And also you did mention the newsletter. So I remember reading the piece in the newsletter about Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe diptych. And by the way, I highly recommend subscribing to the newsletter. It comes with some really interesting facts that we sometimes also reference in our podcast apparently now, but it's great. I cannot do an episode on pop without mentioning popcorn. It's not going to happen, guys.
It's my top favorite thing in the world.
Absolutely. Oh my God.
Wait, question. Salty or sweet?
Yeah. Caramel. But closely followed by... I prefer the mix. Simple butter and caramel.
Okay, we're half friends. We're half friends.
We're not friends anymore.
Salty all the way,
also,
girl.
I really regret... Really?
Yeah.
But leaves your lips feeling all
dehydrated. Like you're on a desert island. I love it.
I also really, every time I start talking about food on this podcast, I really regret it because then I feel hungry. History of popcorn. Apparently, so corn is a staple food, but the oldest popcorn known to date was found in New Mexico. In 1948, small heads of corn and individually popped kernels were discovered deep in a dry cave known as the Bat Cave. Ooh.
Wow.
The kernels have since been carbon dated to be approximately 5,600 years old. So I'm really wondering, I'm just, in my head, the images of this little cave painting and these two guys sitting in front of it and just eating popcorn and looking at the painting because, culture and tradition just has to be. Decorated funeral urns in Mexico from 300 AD depict a maize god with popped kernels adorning his headdress. Evidence of popcorn throughout Central and South America, particularly in Peru, Guatemala, and Mexico, is rampant. And Aztec indigenous people used popcorn not only for eating, but also for decorating clothing and other ceremonial embellishments.
These are my kind of people.
Yeah, and popcorn today is still used, right? On Christmas, don't people do the popcorn strings and stuff?
Oh yeah, they do, don't they?
Yeah,
I don't get far enough into that. It's already in me by the time it comes to making
like a string of two popcorns. So indigenous people throughout North America have a rich history of documenting their consumption of popcorn.
Yeah.
Great call, by the way. In addition to the kernels that were found in New Mexico, a kernel approximately 1,000 years old was found in Utah in a cave that was thought to be inhabited by tribal members. And French explorers that came to the New World found popcorn being made by tribal members in the Great Lakes region as well. So apparently popcorn in America go way back. So as colonists began moving to North America, popcorn was not only eaten as a snack, but was also reported to have been eaten with milk and sugar as a breakfast cereal. I'm not sure how bored I can get with that. And so they cooked it with small amounts of molasses and created a small, it's apparently similar to today's kettle corn, but I can't imagine it for some reason. So now by the 1800s, popcorn wasn't commonly made at home. It was sold in general stores, concession stands, mostly because while there were several methods of popping corn, all of these were, the devices weren't home friendly. And in 1885, Charles Creters in Chicago invented a commercial popcorn machine that was pretty mobile. So they could roam about in streets and they had this gasoline burner.
Bless this man.
Yeah, best. People say that the inventor of the AC is the best man ever. No, hands down, Charles Creters. At the same time, now when Charles Creters did this, at the same time, movies started becoming popular. And so popcorn vendors would just go and stand outside theaters, and that's how popcorn became a movie snack.
The true heroes of the generation.
Yeah, I really think so. Yeah. Like, high praise from us here. And then during the Great Depression, as you know, people went into like really dire straits, popcorn was one of the few snack foods that could still be afforded. And even during the Second World War, it continued to be an item that was kind of easy. I think it just lasted long. It was, it just grew as in its popularity even more. And now, with the invention of television, however, attendance in movie theaters dropped, and so did the consumption of popcorn, until in 1981, microwave popcorn was developed, and that caused the home consumption of popcorn to skyrocket, which is where it stays to this day.
There needs to be like a hallelujah noise here.
Yeah.
Microwave popcorn
much joy and happiness from us.
Yeah, the best
the invention and the continuation.
Microwave popcorn is the best invention.
Oh God, yeah, I absolutely agree, yeah. Okay, and that is the history of popcorn.
Now, have you taken a COVID test, Ragini?
Yes, I hate them.
This isn't just our internal way of risk assessing because we're on different continents. A, we're on different continents. B, it's about this interesting article that I read on BBC that is talking about how children are spoofing COVID-19 tests with soft drinks, with pop.
Oh,
I mean, first of all, the ingenuity. I thought sticking half an onion under my armpit would raise my temperature and that would stop me from going to school. But here
does
they are.
Does it
work? It does, apparently.
Okay, good. Thank God.
Temporarily. But then you have the hassle of actually staying at home and not meeting your friends and doing absolutely nothing.
And then sticking like an onion for the rest of the day,
Minor sacrifices. So we will link the article in the blog if you want to go into the actual details of the science behind how a COVID test works and why, Coke or carbonated drinks make you get a positive result. But, so just briefly, the maintaining an ideal pH for the antibodies is key to the correct functioning of a COVID test. And that's the job of the liquid buffer solution that you mix with your sample. So these are with at-home COVID tests that we get here in the UK.
Okay.
And, the critical role of the buffer is highlighted by the fact that if you mix cola with the buffer, then the LFTs behave exactly as you'd expect, negative for COVID-19. So without the buffer, the antibodies in the test are fully exposed to the acidic pH of whatever beverage these kids were pouring into it. And this has a dramatic effect on the structure and function of the antibodies. The structure of the antibodies are maintained by a network of thousands of interactions between various parts of the protein. Not going to go into that, too complicated for little old me. But in acidic conditions, which is created by the liquids that you pour into them, these kids are pouring into them, the protein becomes increasingly positively charged. So as a result, the antibodies...
You get a negative test.
Yeah, positive. You get a positive test. They're trying to stay home. That's the whole
dear. Oh, wow. I fully got this wrong. The wrong way around.
Yeah. I mean, because you have to in the UK at least, you have to self-isolate for at least 10 days if you get a positive test, regardless of whether you've been vaccinated, other people around you are vaccinated, etc. You just have had to anyway. So that's how they get a positive result on these tests. So now the question is there a way to spot a fake positive test? The antibodies...
Yeah, for all the parents out there.
Yeah, for all the parents out there. Don't worry, there's a simple solution. So the antibodies are capable of refolding and regaining their function that was lost once these liquids were poured onto them. So the author of the article tried washing a test that had been dripped with cola with a buffer solution. And sure enough, the immobilized antibodies at the T line regained normal function and released the particles that were problematic, revealing the true negative result on the test. So the author ends the article with, "Children, I applaud your ingenuity, but now that I've found a way to uncover your trickery, I suggest that you use your cunning to devise a set of experiments and test my hypothesis." Great threat, Mark Lodge. I think you might regret your words, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah. For now, if anybody wants a positive test result, we've told you what to do. And if anyone wants to counter and check that, we've told you what to do.
Yeah.
So
we did mark this segment, "Don't do this at home," but really just do what you like. It's not our responsibility. And with that, we come to the end of this super fun episode.
Yeah, very fun actually. And we will see you next week with a short, and the week after that with our 21st long episode.
Oh my God.
So stay with us for the journey, and we're so excited that you've stayed with us so long. And yeah, we will see you soon. Okay, that's it for today. The episode you just heard was edited by Mohit Chandelier. Music for the episode is by Charitha Arora. If you'd like to reach out to us about the podcast, the episode, or you just want to say hi in general, we're on Instagram as Barely Research Facts. You could also come to the website at www.ArtNowThus.in. If you like the podcast, review, subscribe, and please share it with other podcast lovers in your circle. It would mean so much to us. Until next time, bye.